Welcome to the revision video on A Christmas Carol, and in this one we're looking at the plot of the novella and AO1. Before we go through the plot, I just want to look at what is AO1. So the exam is there for us to prove that we know something. We do the course, we complete the GCSE, and then the exam is there for us to prove that we've learned what we were supposed to learn. And that's really what AO1 is about. It's about proving to our examiner that we know what happened in the text, but the marks are really there for proving that we know why those things happened. Now, to do that, we have to prove we understand the themes of the text, the big ideas, why the author chose to write it. Basically, the things that happen in the novella and why they happened and how they make us think about the themes of the book. AO1 is always rooted in the question, so for AO1 you need to read the question really carefully and keep that question in mind throughout your response. Always ask yourself, why did the writer include this moment? Why did the writer include this character? Why did the writer include this scene? Why did it happen? And if you can explain that, you're going to do okay. So AO1 is about proving we know the book and proving that we know why things happened in the book, why they were included by the writer. An easy way to think about that is AO1 is ideas, feelings, and happenings. So it's what happens in the text, the events, what the characters say and do, and then again, importantly, why they do them, why those things happen. It's also about feelings. It's about what characters feel and why they feel that way, but it's also about what the writer wants us to feel as a reader, and also what they felt as a writer. And that brings us to ideas. So what were the writer's ideas when they wrote the book? What did Dickens believe when he wrote A Christmas Carol? How do we see these, or the opposite of these in the text? For example, if the question's on money, where do we see positive examples and negative examples of this? So we could talk about Scrooge and his greed with wealth, and then Fred talking about how we don't need wealth to be happy. We're now going to go through the plot just to recap and revise the key events, the main things that happened during the novella. So we're going to start with Stave 1, Marley's ghost. At the beginning of the novella, we learn that Marley is dead and that Scrooge is just like him. He's described as having not painted out Marley's name and answering to Marley's name sometimes. The novella then begins properly on Christmas Eve with Scrooge in his counting house. His clerk, who's not named in this stave, but we learn later his name is Bob Cratchit, he's working hard and he's trying to warm himself over a candle because Scrooge refuses to give him any more coal. So it really makes it clear Scrooge is greedy and he doesn't really care about Bob. Bob representing the working class and Scrooge representing the wealthy bourgeoisie, the middle class. Scrooge's nephew, Fred, arrives, a character that's opposite to Scrooge in nearly every way. And when he arrives, he wishes him a Merry Christmas and invites his uncle to Christmas dinner. So Fred represents family and he represents the opposite ideas of Scrooge. In fact, Fred's a really good character to talk about if we want to talk about Dickens' ideas, because Fred is a mouthpiece for Dickens. He shares with us Dickens' ideas about Christmas and money. Scrooge responds with bah, humbug, which means nonsense, rubbish, I don't believe it, I don't believe in Christmas, which means I don't believe in festivity and giving and kindness and family. So bah, humbug explains to us that he doesn't really like a lot of things about community. And we learn that he values money more than family. He challenges Fred on this. After that, two portly gentlemen arrive, collecting for the poor. They're portly, which means they're a little overweight, they're a little larger, and portly is quite a pleasant way to describe somebody who's got a little bit more weight. This shows us that they're probably middle class, they're certainly wealthy enough to afford food. They can make themselves slightly overweight by feeding themselves. And this in the Victorian era, remember, was a sign of being financially stable. So the two portly gentlemen arrive and they collect for the poor. Now this is reassuring for our reader because the portly gentlemen who are wealthy, they can still collect for the poor, so they can be wealthy and be good. So they reassure the reader that we can be that as well. We don't have to be like Scrooge. Scrooge refuses to give them a donation, and he says that the prisons and the workhouses should provide for those sorts of people. He says that if they can't go to prison or the workhouses, then they should just die and decrease the surplus population. Now, that's an idea that was popularised by Thomas Malthus, called Malthusian theory. And Dickens disagreed with this and wanted to show us just how inhumane it was. Then Scrooge travels back home and he sees Marley's face in his door knocker and then on the tiles around his fireplace, almost foreshadowing Marley's appearance. Marley's ghost appears after frightening Scrooge, reveals that his punishment in death was to wander around the world, to wander around the places that he didn't wander when he was alive, to see the suffering in the world that he could have helped, but now he's got no chance of helping those people. Part of his punishment is to wear chains, and those chains are surrounded by purses and cash boxes and ledgers, things that represent the greed he had in life. So his punishment reflects the life that he led. He says that Scrooge will have the same fate, and indeed Scrooge 7 years ago when Marley died had a chain just as long, and he's worked on it for 7 years by being greedy and by being selfish. And if he doesn't change, his fate will be the same as Marley's. And that links us back nicely to the start of the stave, where we learn that Marley and Scrooge are very similar to each other. He tells Scrooge he's going to be haunted by 3 spirits. Scrooge is reluctant to start with, but as the novella goes on, we're going to see that change. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. Scrooge is visited by the first spirit when the bell tolls 1. The ghost of Christmas Past appears and is a strange figure that looks both like an old man and a child. It's got a light upon its head, it's got some holly in its hand, and a candle extinguisher for a cap. All of these things are quite important because the fact that it looks like an old man and a child reminds us that our childhood connects us to our present. Scrooge was a child once, and the things that happen to us in childhood can affect us when we become older. And that's something that Dickens really believed in. He believed that children deserved to have happy childhoods, but saw that many children, particularly poor children, didn't have that. The light upon its head can remind us that the ghost is there to shine a light on Scrooge's past, something he's forgotten up until now. And the extinguisher on that would go on the ghost's head is there to get rid of that light. And it represents the greedy people like Scrooge that don't want to look at their past or remember the lessons of community and family. The ghost then shows Scrooge scenes from his childhood. First, Scrooge sees himself as a solitary child, all on his own on Christmas. He sees another Christmas after that, just as he's becoming a man, where his younger sister brings him home for Christmas. Now, this is Fred's mother. And he loves his sister. She's full of energy and she's an incredibly positive character. And she allows Scrooge to come home, to return to the family, which is something that Fred tries to do in the present. Scrooge then witnesses a very lively scene with his old boss, Fezziwig, who's a role model for Scrooge. And when older Scrooge sees Fezziwig, he's reminded that Fezziwig's very similar to him. He's a wealthy man, but he heaps fuel on the fire. He welcomes everybody from the community in to have a Christmas party, and he shakes hands with everybody. So despite his wealth, he treats everybody with positivity and kindness, and he's very much a part of the community. So he offers an example to Scrooge of who he could be. The final 2 scenes show Scrooge seeing a time when his younger self is with his fiancée, Belle, and she's leaving him because he's changed and he now seems to love money more than her. He's rejected a family and a relationship because of money, partly because Scrooge is scared that if he becomes poor, he'll end up like many of the other impoverished people in Victorian London at the time. He then sees the girl become a woman with a very happy family, and Scrooge is upset by seeing this. He wishes that he could have been a father and have been a husband and had a family. It makes him so upset that he wrestles with the spirit and he tries to put the cap over the spirit's light. He doesn't fully succeed because the light still shines out, suggesting that Scrooge is on his way to redemption. Stave 3, the second of the 3 spirits. The second spirit we meet is the ghost of Christmas Present, a ghost that looks a little bit like Jesus and a little bit like Father Christmas. He takes Scrooge through the streets of London on Christmas morning and he shows how much food's available. He's sitting on a throne of food himself, and we have almost 2 full pages with lots and lots of description of the food that's available. And Dickens does this to show us that there's plenty of food. So people like Thomas Malthus and Scrooge in Stave 1, when he says, if poor people can't feed themselves, they should die. Dickens is trying to show us that there's plenty of food to go round. We just need to share it out much more evenly. Scrooge asks the spirit why a poor dinner matters most, something that the spirit says to him. And the spirit says that it matters most because the poor don't have a lot to give. Scrooge then challenges him and says, but you close all the shops on Sundays because the church says that on Sunday you can't open your businesses. And the spirit says, no, the church does that, not the Christian message, not Christian spirit. And so some people who belong to the church should think about whether they're actually being good people. Now, Dickens believed that the church, preaching their ideas that the poor were sinners, were actually missing the point of the messages of the Bible, of the New Testament. Scrooge then meets the Cratchit family, where he sees the kindness and humility they have, even though they're a poor family. And Scrooge is saddened when he sees that Tiny Tim, Bob's youngest son, is sick and starts to realise he's responsible for this family. Next, the spirit shows Scrooge his nephew and friends as they celebrate and they joke about how Scrooge is a ridiculous fellow. And we see that Fred, even though they take the mickey out of Scrooge a little bit, he says that he will go to offer Scrooge a chance to come to Christmas dinner every year, and he'll do it because of Christmas. Because Christmas is a time when we forgive and we open up our hearts and we let other people back in. The ghost shows him all manner of people and places that are in hard and dark places, places which are isolated. And in every single one of those places, although they have reason to be sad, the people there are actually full of happiness. We see a lighthouse and we see some miners, places that aren't very pleasant to live, but these people are still happy. And then the final thing that the ghost shows us is 2 poor children, ignorance and want. And these are connected to the spirit. They're not real children. They're almost they act as metaphors for the idea of children who are growing up in ignorance, who are not being taught, who don't have happy lives, and want, children who are going without the bare necessities, the basic necessities they need to grow up healthily. And they act as a warning to Scrooge of what might happen if we treat our children like this. Our society is going to end up being pretty unpleasant. The ghost disappears and a hooded phantom approaches Scrooge. Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The final spirit looks a little bit like the personification of Death, the Grim Reaper, because in this stave everything is very dark and hopeless. This stave is showing Scrooge a future that could happen if people like Scrooge don't become better people. If people remain greedy and unpleasant, this is the kind of future we can expect. And he leads Scrooge through scenes relating to a man's death. He sees businessmen who joke about the death and they say no one will go to the funeral, but they might if they get a good lunch out of it. So they're very selfish and in it for themselves. The ghost then takes him to an old shop run by a man called Old Joe, who's a desperately poor man, and 3 people arrive to sell goods that they've stolen from this dead man. And it's pretty ghoulish and pretty unpleasant. These people are laughing over the dead man, and they talk about the fact that this dead man was so selfish and greedy in life. Why couldn't they be greedy and selfish over his remains now that he's gone? We also then see a couple that's thankful that the man died because it gives them time to get their rent money. And everything Scrooge is seeing here is making him feel more and more upset by the fact that these people have no hope and they're so selfish and they're enjoying the idea that this man is dead. The ghost then shows Scrooge to the Cratchits, whose son Tiny Tim has also died, and they're desperately sad about the loss of their son. Scrooge is effectively shown the consequences of not caring for the poor and of not caring for children. Finally, the ghost and Scrooge arrive at a graveyard. So it's metaphorically the end of the line. The last place somebody would go is to the graveyard. You're never going to get out of it. And once you're dead, you can't change your future. You can't do anything to affect the world. And we see the gravestone of the man that people have been talking about, and it says Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge, realizing that his time is limited and he wants to change, and when he sees his gravestone, he realizes if he's dead, he can't change anything. And he gets down on his knees in sorrow and he promises to be a better man. He says that he will hold Christmas in his heart and he will celebrate it in the past, the present, and the future. Stave 5, the end of it. Scrooge wakes up on Christmas Day full of energy and life. He doesn't realise it's Christmas Day. He thinks the ghosts have taken 3 days to deliver their messages. He acts in an incredibly dramatic fashion. He's very hyperbolic and the bells are ringing out to show the excitement that Scrooge has returned to being a good person and returned to the community. He calls out of the window to a boy who tells him it's Christmas Day, and Scrooge is delighted to find out that actually he hasn't missed Christmas because he wants to start doing things properly. And there's a message here about the fact that it's not enough to choose to change. We actually then have to act out that change. We have to change ourselves. He gives the boy £0.50, quite a lot of money, for a boy to go and get a turkey. And then he has it delivered to the Cratchits anonymously, showing us that we can give to other people. And it's not about taking credit for it or being seen to be somebody who's generous. Just the act of being generous itself is enough. Scrooge goes out into the street where he meets one of the portly charity collectors and he whispers a donation to the man, who's incredibly grateful. He whispers it again because it doesn't matter how much he gives to charity, just the act of giving to charity is enough. Then Scrooge goes to church, he explores the town and finally goes to Fred's for Christmas dinner. And through all of this, he reconnects with people, community, he shows an interest in others, and finally he rejoins his family. The next day, Scrooge offers Bob Cratchit a pay rise and promises to help look after his family. He shows responsibility, social responsibility for the poor and for the family that are directly dependent on Scrooge. He learns how to laugh at himself and he becomes known as a man who knows how to celebrate Christmas and all of its messages. So with the plot being covered, it's useful to talk about the message that's contained in each stave. Stave 1 teaches us that being considerate and kind is what distinguishes us from animals. Scrooge is described as less than human throughout the entire stave, and that's because he doesn't show any kind of consideration. Stave 2, the message is about how our childhood is linked closely to the adult that we're going to become. Stave 3, Dickens is trying to show us that Malthusian theory is nonsense, and he tries to show us with the Cratchits the direct responsibility that the bourgeoisie have for the proletariat, or that the middle classes have for the poor. In Stave 4, it's the consequences of our actions. We see the broad and wide-ranging impact that Scrooge and selfish people like him have on others. And then Stage 5, the message is that it's never too late to change and be redeemed. As long as you choose to do it, you've always got an opportunity. And then throughout the whole novella, the underlying teachings are look to the Bible, particularly the New Testament, for your religious teachings, not the Victorian church who Dickens disagreed with. When we think about AO1, it's important to think about themes. The question will be on a theme, and knowing these themes is quite important to helping us understand the book. The themes that you see here are the themes that are likely to come up. You might see them phrased differently in the exam paper. For example, money might be used instead of greed or poverty or charity, but the ideas are the same. For social responsibility, Dickens is trying to teach us through the book that we should be more socially responsible. It's one of his key messages. Originally, he was going to write a pamphlet about this and realised he would get his message across better to a wider group of people if he wrote a novella. He's right, because over 150 years since it was written, it's still in print. Dickens shows us charitable characters who we're supposed to like the portly gentleman and Fezziwig. They're generous and kind, but also overweight and reassuring to us. You don't have to give everything away. You don't have to make yourself poor yourself to be kind and philanthropic. There's a contrast between how Scrooge treats Bob in Stave 1 and how he was treated by Fezziwig in Stave 2. And we can see one as an example of how we should behave and one obviously as an example of how we shouldn't. When we see want and ignorance, we see strong commentary on social responsibility there. Dickens believed that if we mistreated children, if we mistreated the poor, and we caused financial and social problems, we are going to lead to a society that's not particularly fair and pretty unkind. Education and charity would have a deep impact and significantly improve charity, so we should invest in those things more. Tiny Tim's a victim of society that doesn't value the poor or people with disabilities. If Bob was better paid, the Cratchits would be able to afford a better diet and potentially medical help. When we talk about family and community, the Cratchits are probably the most important family in the entire novella because they're subverting the belief, the Victorian belief, that poor people were sinners. The church was preaching this quite widely at the time, but the Cratchits are united, grateful, and they're Christian. Their Christmas is the very centre of the book, and it shows us that their family, their bond, is at the very heart of this novella. We repeatedly see Scrooge reject family. He rejects Fred in Stave 1, but in Stave 2 he also rejects family when he lets Belle walk away, when he rejects her love, and that future would have included marriage and children, family. We see that in the final scene in Stave 2. We also see that Scrooge's father undergoes significant change in the novella. There's a potential foreshadowing of Scrooge's change and remind us that family will always forgive and be there. The idea is reinforced when Fred comes to Scrooge in Stave 1 to invite him to Christmas dinner, and then in Stave 5 when Fred welcomes him back unflinchingly and without reservation. It's never too late to make amends and reconnect with our family, is what Dickens is trying to tell us. We're shown a vision of Belle as a mother and with a large family, and at this point we see that Scrooge is incredibly unhappy and he fights with the ghost of Christmas past to avoid having to look at it. He regrets not being a father, and he wishes that he could have had a child, could have been married. He does then get to be a second father to Tiny Tim at the end of the novella, but it's only a second father because he missed his first chance. For Christmas and festivity, we've got the presentation of the Ghost of Christmas Present, this cross between Father Christmas and Jesus, reminding us of the importance of Christmas for somebody who's Christian, this connection to the messages and the beliefs and the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. He's a jolly giant to reflect the joy that can be gained through properly celebrating the day and embracing the values of Christmas. It's a significant holiday or celebration because it's a socially unifying event. Everybody comes together as a Christian during this Christian holiday. In Stave 3, we see that Christmas is everywhere, regardless of where you are, despite the fact that there are some people on ships and in mines and in the darker places of the world. They are happy. And the Cratchits, who have no money, they are happy too. So Christmas is associated with togetherness, songs, fires, which Dickens uses as a symbol of inclusion and connection to community. We see a contrast between the Cratchits' humble Christmas and Fred's more luxurious one, but both are about fun, gratitude, and being together. Scrooge's rejection of Christmas in Stave 1 is challenged by Fred, who's, as I said before, Dickens' mouthpiece, where he says it's a kind, forgiving, charitable, and pleasant time. So we can see the contrast in values there. This contrast obviously is made even more clear when in Stave 5 we see Scrooge changed and he becomes a different man, so different from the Scrooge he was in Stave 1. And he sends a turkey to the Cratchits, he goes to church, and he spends the day with Fred. For the theme of memory in the past, we learn that the past has a huge impact on our present. Scrooge is a solitary child in Stave 2 when he's younger, and then becomes solitary as an oyster in adulthood. If we are treated badly or have bad childhoods, it is likely to affect our present. We learn all about his past in Stave 2, which creates pathos and empathy and understanding for him, so we can accept and understand why he behaves the way he does, and we can see the consequences of it too. The Ghost of Christmas Past is like a child and also like an old man, to emphasise the connection between memory and identity. He's also incredibly strong with these long muscular arms, and it reflects the ghost's willingness to force Scrooge to engage with and learn from the past. And that light on his head allows us to look at the past, suggesting that we should examine things that have happened to us in the past and learn from them. We see that Scrooge seems to struggle the most with the visions involving Belle, and perhaps that's his deepest regret. And the pain that this caused him, could understand why he's resistant to allowing himself to get close to anyone. And that could be linked to the death of his sister, Fan. They were very close, and he might be rejecting Fred because of that connection and possibly because of his resemblance to her. With childhood, again, we need to think about the importance of Scrooge's childhood and the effect it has on him when he becomes an adult. When we talk about childhood, Tiny Tim is probably the most important child we can talk about, because he shows us the innocence of childhood. He's Christ-like in that he is poor, like Jesus was in the Bible. He's good, and he kind of metaphorically dies in Stave 4 before being resurrected in Stave 5. Now, obviously, he doesn't actually die, because that's the future, but there are some connections to him and Jesus. He's virtuous and almost hyperbolically perfect. Now, Dickens did that on purpose to show us that the poor can be good people. He challenges the idea that poor people are only workers and that they're sinners, like the church was teaching. And there's possible links there as well to Dickens' own disabled nephew, who he was quite fond of. Scrooge gets to be a second father to Tiny Tim and look after him. And as a result of that, Tiny Tim doesn't die. So there's a message about looking after our young people. The Victorians saw childhood as an idyllic time, but Dickens knew that wasn't the case for poor people and the proletariat. Children often started work from an early age, and more than 25% of all children died before their 5th birthday. And then finally, the portrayal of ignorance and want, who are victims of a society that refuses to look after people. And we see the consequences of that when they become adults, and some of those consequences we see by how dark society is in Stave 4. The theme of redemption and change. This is a very important theme. This is a Christian redemption story. Scrooge undertakes a huge transformation across the novella, from this parsimonious and avaricious character to a generous and philanthropic one in Stave 5. In Stave 1, Scrooge feels that he's isolated and solitary, but Dickens shows us that he has an enormous impact on those around him. We see the effect that he has on all of the people that visit him. We also see that Tiny Tim and the Cratchits are deeply affected by him. When he changes, Tiny Tim is saved, the Cratchits' fortunes change, and the world becomes a better place because of it. In A Christmas Carol, the bell reflects God and the Christian message, and we see in Stave 1 that God is almost upset with Scrooge and losing hope. But the change that he undergoes by Stave 5, after he sent all of these messengers to, or after Scrooge has been visited rather by all these messengers, we see that the bells are ringing out loudly. So it's almost as if the heavens are rejoicing and ringing loudly to reflect the joy at Scrooge's redemption. Scrooge therefore manages to avoid Marley's afterlife in purgatory. In Stave 1, where Scrooge is a covetous old sinner, the weather's dark and foggy, and it shows he's metaphorically blind to the world around him. By the end, the weather's changed hugely. There's no fog, there's no mist, it's bright and clear, and it emphasises the impact that an individual can have on the world. With greed, poverty and charity, the first characters we should look at are the portly gentlemen, and they allow us to see how Scrooge's attitude towards money changes throughout the novella. At the start, he dismisses them, and he says that he doesn't think he should be giving to charity. And then by the end, we see him giving a donation to them. He keeps that secret because you don't need to announce what you're giving, but just giving is a good thing to do. Scrooge doesn't do anything with his money. Fred talks about this in Stave 3, about how it doesn't do him any good. He's incredibly miserly, but he lives a poor life, rendering his money worthless. He lives in small rooms surrounded by business to emphasise how his life entirely revolves around money. And this fixation on money rather than people means that when in Stave 4, he dies alone and people steal from him. Dickens is reminding us of the time that you have to give to charity and use your money. You can do it willingly or have it taken from you. When Scrooge is shown the impoverished couple that are happy that he's died and the businessmen who are indifferent, the poor people who steal from him and mock his money and the way he lived, we see the consequences of a life that revolves around money. Tiny Tim and ignorance and want, they're all victims of a society that's greedy and doesn't care about them, full of people like Scrooge. We also see the impact of Scrooge's greed in his breakup with Belle. He replaces her love with a golden idol with money, and his life is worse for having done that. The last thing we're going to look at is planning your response. This is what the question will look like, and the first thing you need to do is read the question, which will be at the bottom of the sheet. It might be on the next page if the extract's quite long, so make sure you read the question first and highlight what the focus is, the themes and the characters that you're going to be writing about. Then read the extract. Make sure you read the context box at the top so that you know when this is happening. It really does help. And then highlight any quotes that relate to the question as you're reading through. Then choose the quotes you're going to be writing about and annotate them. Put some ideas next to them that you can return to. You'll probably think of more when you're writing, but it just gives you a good starting point. Then find some space on your page to mind map the theme. Now, this is the sort of thing you'll want to do when you're annotating an AO1 quote. There are some questions on the right that will help you analyse AO1 quotes and AO1 ideas. The more you practice this, the quicker you will get with it. So let's have a go at this. So grab a piece of paper and a pen, and I want you to try to answer some of these questions about this quote. So here Scrooge has just seen Fezziwig's party and he's been reminded how happy his acts have made others. The quote is this: "His power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it's impossible to add and count them up. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." So go through the questions on the right hand side. Try and answer them all if you can. So who says this? And to whom do they say it? That's important because if we know something about those characters, it can give us some information about the quote. We know that Scrooge was greedy, but this is Scrooge saying this now, and that's important because it shows a change in his character. Then, what is it about and what does it mean? What is Scrooge saying? What do his words mean? Why is he saying this? What's the point of it? What does it mean? Just explain it at its most simple level. Then, what does it suggest? What are we learning about Scrooge's change? What are we learning about the idea of money versus happiness? What does it reveal about the theme or the character that you're writing about? And what are we supposed to learn as a reader? How are we supposed to feel about it? Then try and make some connections. Is there something here we can write about context? Is there something we can write here about the characters that are involved? Is there another connection we can make here to the plot elsewhere, to moments that happen elsewhere in the novella? And what's the writer's intent here? What's Dickens' message? When he has Scrooge say this, what's the writer's message? Take some time to work through that now, pausing the video. And when you're ready to start, just click play. The last part of analysing the quote there was about the writer's intent, the authorial intent of the writer. There are some phrases here you could use to write about it. You should try and include a comment like this in every paragraph. Why is the writer writing about this book? Why have they included this scene or this character? So we could write this like this: Dickens may have included this scene in the book to explore, to criticise, to warn, to reveal, to celebrate. Using a sentence like this in your responses will really help to articulate to your examiner that you understand that the writer wrote this and they had a reason for writing it. And then going back to the bit where we said mind map a theme. This is how I might do it. I would write the theme of the question in the middle and I'd be thinking about what happens in the rest of the novella. This will be really important in my second paragraph, in my second AO1 paragraph. So for social responsibility, for example, what happens? What are the events? What do the characters do? What do they say? And then after that, we can talk about why they're important. Which characters are the most important to talk about if we're talking about social responsibility? The question might have given you one or more, but can you talk about other characters as well? Where do we see the opposite of this? So we don't just have to talk about when people are socially responsible. We can talk about when they're not as well. Both sides of the coin, both the good and the bad, are important to talk about to have a full response. And try to write down quotes, even small ones, as you go. Just knowing that Scrooge as a small boy was solitary, that's one word, but it's a quote and it counts as a reference. And that's it. If you can use this video and your notes to remember the plot, to remember the characters, and to remember the themes, and have ideas about them, then AO1 shouldn't be too tricky. Make sure you go back over the video if you need to and pause it at the right moments. And I hope that this was helpful.